Hello everyone and welcome to a new video dedicated to our beloved Snoopy and the world of Peanuts. The December 18th, 1950 strip is a perfect example of the subtle humor and satire typical of the Peanuts' early years. In this cartoon, Schulz plays with the simplicity of childhood interactions, turning them into an ironic reflection on the ways of adults. The scene takes place in a snowy landscape, evoking a typical winter atmosphere that serves as the backdrop for Shermy and Charlie Brown's encounter. The two characters exchange a brief dialogue that mimics adult conversations, but which, on closer inspection, is devoid of any real meaningful content. This contrast between the form of the speech and its actual substance creates a comic situation, emphasizing the way children absorb and reproduce, sometimes unconsciously, attitudes and ways of expressing themselves typical of the adult world. The interaction between Shermy and Charlie Brown is constructed in a way that emphasizes their young age and their attempt to replicate patterns of conversation that they do not fully understand. The climax comes with Charlie Brown's final line, which closes the scene with an ironic twist, emphasizing the absurdity of the entire conversation and offering food for thought about human behavior through the lens of childhood innocence. In the first vignette, Charlie Brown and Shermy meet in the snow and greet each other in a very formal way. Shermy, with her hat, and Charlie Brown, with his characteristic ears covered by heavy earmuffs, are standing opposite each other in a pose reminiscent of adult encounters as they pass each other on the street. The scene exudes a feeling of detachment and formality, as if the two are making a social gesture rather than an actual exchange between children. Schulz also conveys this formality through the posture of the two characters, who look each other straight in the eye with a certain composure. Their every movement seems to be measured, as if the greeting is more of a ritual than a natural expression of affection. The use of a simple greeting as the opening of the strip is not accidental. From his earliest years, Schulz shows great skill in turning everyday moments into scenes that go beyond their apparent significance. The fact that the two children greet each other with such seriousness already creates a contrast that anticipates the irony of the final joke, an irony that would become one of Peanuts' defining characteristics. Shermy, in these early months of the strip, is one of the main characters and often assumes the role of Charlie Brown's interlocutor, a position that would later be occupied by more iconic characters such as Linus or Schroeder. In the second vignette, Charlie Brown comments on the weather, saying that it looks like it will get colder, and Shermy responds with a brief, neutral assent. This exchange of banter is typical of many adult conversations, especially those made out of courtesy rather than genuine interest. Schulz captures this mechanism perfectly and transports it to the world of children, highlighting how they too can replicate these patterns without real purpose. The expressions of the two characters are very restrained, almost impassive, and the framing remains simple and direct, with no particular changes from the previous vignette. This helps create the sense of monotony that characterizes these kinds of conversations. Schulz loved to emphasize the irony of everyday life through minute details, and here he does so to great effect. The dialogue seems to make sense, but in fact adds nothing significant, highlighting the superficial and almost automatic nature of many social interactions. Weather was a recurring theme in the early years of the Peanuts, and Schulz often used it to create scenarios that added atmosphere to the strips, but without ever distracting too much attention from the characters and their small, ironic daily lives. In the third vignette, the tone of the conversation takes on an even more artificial and constructed tinge. Charlie Brown and Shermy exchange two phrases that sound like advice, but are actually idioms with no real deep meaning. Charlie Brown tells Charlie Brown not to accept wooden coins, an expression that was common in the United States at the time and meant "don't be fooled." Wood coins were used in some areas as an alternative value in the early decades of the 20th century, but they had no real value, so to accept them was to be naive. This saying was already somewhat dated in the 1950s, and Schulz may have chosen it precisely to emphasize the contrast between adult language and the age of his characters. Shermy responds with another typical saying, "Don't do anything I wouldn't do." This, too, is a phrase often heard among adults and is used as general advice, although in reality it is rather vague and lacking in concrete meaning. The fact that two children exchange these sayings, which sound like mature and wise advice, creates a subtle comic effect, but also an implicit reflection on the way adult language is absorbed and repeated without necessarily being understood. In this exchange, the author plays with the contrast between the characters' intention and their actual ability to grasp the meaning of words. Schulz loved to explore these aspects of communication, and he does so masterfully here, using the lightness of dialogue to suggest a critique of the way adults often use words without really thinking about them. In the fourth and final vignette, Charlie Brown turns away from Shermie, reflecting on the conversation he has just had and commenting in a wry tone that that was a real adult conversation. This moment marks the humorous and reflective climax of the strip. Charlie Brown not only acknowledges the absurdity of the exchange, but underscores it with a joke that breaks the serious tone of the scene, showing his awareness. The fact that Schulz entrusts a child with the ability to understand the futility of the dialogue is what makes this strip particularly brilliant. The contrast between the simplicity of the characters and the complexity of their observations is one of the strengths of Peanuts and would become a hallmark of the comic strip throughout its life. In addition, the way Charlie Brown walks away with his hands in his pockets and a thoughtful expression adds another layer of meaning to the scene. The gesture suggests that this is not just a joke, but a broader reflection on human behavior and the dynamics of communication. This small detail further enriches the scene, leaving the reader to ponder the content of that adult conversation. The December 18th, 1950 strip is a perfect example of Schulz's ability to use a simple format to convey profound concepts. The idea that children can recognize and reproduce adult conventions, but without attaching real value to them, is a theme that will return often in the Peanuts. Schulz, with his extraordinary keenness in observing human nature, manages to turn a banal exchange of jokes into a reflection on communication and the repetition of catchphrases, once again demonstrating his talent for capturing reality in a subtle and ironic way. The minimalism of the strip, both in the drawing and in the dialogue, is another key element of his style, allowing the jokes to emerge more forcefully, lending a thought-provoking lightness. The choice of the winter setting, with snow covering everything, adds a sense of quiet and isolation, creating the perfect atmosphere for the tone of the conversation between the two children. In the early years of the Peanuts, winter was not just an aesthetic choice, but represented an opportunity to explore social dynamics related to the season, such as the need to exchange greetings and pleasantries when meeting each other on the street, a gesture that almost took on symbolic value. This strip is a demonstration of how Schulz could make the ordinary extraordinary. There is no big visual gag, no exceptional event, just two children talking. But in this exchange, there is all the brilliance and subtle humor that would make the Peanuts one of the most beloved comics of all time, touching on universal themes with a fresh and original approach.
If you enjoyed yourselves, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and activate the little bell to stay updated, and see you next, friends.